Welcome to the Debate at Go8 podcast series exploring issues and research affecting the Group of 8 universities and, by extension, Australia's economy and our society. My name's Ron Cantelards. I'm a freelance journalist and producer, and throughout this series we've been canvassing a range of topics touching upon the work of all the Group of 8 universities. They include the Australian National University, Monash University, UNSW Sydney, the Universities of Adelaide, Melbourne, Sydney, Queensland and Western Australia. The Go8 comprises Australia's leading research-intensive universities, and today we'll be looking at one of the big issues confronting all of them, the commercialisation of their research and the impact it has on our economy and our way of life. In the pod booth studio with me is Go8 CEO Vicky Thompson, and speaking to us via Zoom is Dr. Dean Moss from Uniquest, Australia's leading university commercialisation entity, managing the intellectual property of the University of Queensland. To you, firstly, Dr. Dean Moss, Uniquest has had considerable success in commercialising university research work. Its innovation portfolio includes Australia's first blockbuster vaccine, Gardasil. It started as groundbreaking research at the University of Queensland and is now used in more than 145 countries in the fight against cervical cancer. How did this breakthrough happen, and do you think it serves as a bit of a template for the way research could be commercialised at other Australian universities in future?
Well, thanks, Ron. It's a remarkable story and a remarkable commercialisation outcome for Australia. Professor Ian Fraser and the late Dr. Jan Zhao, you pursued quality research, and they were very interested in how to make a vaccine, an effective vaccine against the human papillomavirus. They chose to pursue a very technically challenging pathway of trying to make a virus-like particle that would mimic the virus but would be non-infectious, that would activate the immune system to raise a reasonable response that would provide protective immunity to individuals. And that was a very early conceptual thing. In 1990, that work started. We filed the first patents in 1991. We moved it across in partnership, and it's a very strong element of collaboration on this with CSL in 1994, 95. And then after many years of working in that space, we got closer towards clinic, and it moved to a license with Merck as a global pharmaceutical company with interest in vaccines, and they led the late stage clinical development of this right the way through to registration in 2006 with the FDA. And then that's moved to further registrational approvals for its use beyond women, but to men. So, the elements of it, it's a long journey, 15 years before there was regulatory approval and first commercial sale. It is on the market as a global blockbuster. It's not just a prophylactic vaccine, it'll be the first to eradicate a cancer, and that's what's truly remarkable about it. So quality science, long time frames, collaborative support with industry.
So explain to us how Uniquest and the University of Queensland work together. Where does the money for their research come from?
So that is in the most part publicly funded, so competitive grant support for research, and that is essential in this space, particularly biomedical. It's a very costly endeavour on the human capital side. These are highly trained researchers, and the research infrastructure that is required to allow them to do that work is expensive in a capital nature. So you need, state-of-the-art facilities that exist right the way across the Group of 8 universities to allow this sort of frontier biomedical research to occur.
So can you explain to us how the commercialisation of university research works? What needs to happen to bring great ideas to the marketplace?
Given that, the quality research that goes on within the Group of 8, commercialisation or tech transfer officers such as ourselves are closely embedded into that research interface with people that are trained in the sciences but have an industry background. And they work with our researchers to identify things that are novel breakthroughs. We look to see whether we can get a proprietary position on that it's truly a eureka moment, something that we can protect, because for industry to partner with us, they need a commercial monopoly opportunity, and that's what a patent gives you, or protecting a piece of know-how. Not all is patent. And so we would then identify that as a discovery, and we will identify both an IP management strategy of how to prosecute and protect that IP over the years, and a commercialisation strategy which is really responsive to the needs of the market to lean in on the technology and say, to develop that, these are the key steps that we'll need to pursue. And that's usually a collaborative endeavour with industry.
So when we're discussing commercialisation of university research, many experts refer to this notion of the valley of death. What is it and how do we avoid it?
Well, it's unavoidable because there is not a clear continuum between competitive grant funding, which occurs from the Australian Research Council and the National Health and Medical Research Council, are two primary funders of research in Australia. That once you've got an idea that looks to have some commercial potential, essentially you move into a new realm where you've got the highest technical risk, you've got an IP risk and you've got a market risk. The technology is generally unproven, but you need to develop some proof of concept data around it to allow industry to look to see what the value proposition to them is. So is it better, faster, cheaper for them in a manufacturing sense? And so they will not invest early in a collaboration when the grants have run out. And there isn't a continuum of grants into the translational space, and it's one of our big calls to government, is to support this early stage translation. And that is the valley of death, where you've got high risk and you've got a very significant barrier to putting large investable sums of money to do that translation, given that risk and return profile.
How many opportunities do you think we've lost as a result of that gap?
Well, in our own case, if we're getting, say, 130 disclosures of novel intellectual property inventions per year, I'd say there's a multiple that we are then unable to translate because we don't get a robust data set around them to show the value proposition to industry. And it's not just through our eyes. Our thing is to take it to the market. And there is this whole sense of market push. It's universities invent, and industry are not just waiting for you to put a placard up and say, look what we've invented. Industry are very much interfaced into our universities looking for these, but they can't invest where they don't see the value proposition. They see a research project. What they want is an investable opportunity to partner on. And so there is always a multiple of what we're seeing that industry eyes would say, if there was something more to that, we could develop a proprietary position and we could exploit that commercially.
To you, Vicky, it could be said that Australia's had a pretty mediocre record when it comes to, commercialising many of the wonderful innovations uncovered in this country at our universities. Would you agree?
No.
No?
Very strongly would reject that assertion, Ron, that we are mediocre. And in fact, it's rhetoric that has sort of slipped in to the discussion. I think it's worth noting that our revenue across the group of 8 from commercialisation is 0.5% of our total revenue. So it's around $81 million. Stanford, and most people know Stanford University, in the heart of Silicon Valley, famous for many things, Google being the one that I think most people listening and or watching potentially on through Google, came out of Stanford, very conservatively calculated in 2018 commercialisation income of $39.4 million. And that's around 0.6% of their operating revenue. So even those, the big universities where this is their bread and butter, there is still a challenge in terms of the commercialisation output. And we are constantly described as being poor at commercialisation and ranking low amongst our peers, but by several measures it's just not true. And so we rank higher than countries like Canada and Israel when it comes to resourcing commercialisation. So that's based on a staffing ratio metric.
Than Israel?
On that particular aspect. Our licensing activity per $100 million of research expenditure is higher than Canada and the US. Our licensing revenue to research expenditure ratios comparable to the UK and well above Canada and Japan. So there are several sort of metrics that you can look at to say that we're doing okay. That's not to say we can do more and can do better. And there is this missing gap that Dean's referred to in terms of, that sort of translational aspect. But I think it's, we've got to go in and be loud and proud about the fact that we're actually doing a pretty good job. And we've had Gardasil is one we hear about a lot, and I'm happy to talk a bit later about a couple of the others. Cochlear is another. But there are so many that we've had spin out of our universities which have not only just been, fantastic in terms of the numbers, but have actually provided improved productivity for industry, changed and saved people's lives, a whole raft of those things. We need to do more, we can do more, but we can only do so much in the funding constraints we've got. Would you say that's a sort of fair assessment?
Absolutely, Vicky. I mean, it's a question of scale. I think we push above our weight, and I think it's been a convenience to say that we've been poor at commercialisation as a broad brushstroke. When, yes, our collective efforts of, 42 new companies last year across the group of 8, a portfolio of some 240, our commercial returns at our own university are over 800 million over the last 20 years. It's 40 million a year. That's above Stanford in its best year. So, the sector does really, really well because you have to put in the context of what our industry base is in this country. And when it's 99% small to medium enterprise, the absorptive capacity of that industry for new technologies emerging from our university, notwithstanding their inability on a human capital side to partner with our universities to pull technologies into industry, that is the rate limiting step. So it's a whole of ecosystem conversation, not just, the blame is on the universities not exploiting their research potential.
Yeah. So what else needs to be done then? What more should the federal government be doing?
Well, in our submissions to the federal consultation, they've been very much aligned to industry's proposals around this, which is to have some premium incentives to heighten the need for greater collaboration between industry and academics. And we need to increase the transferability of the skill set between researchers in our universities into industry. And we have some beautiful PhD internship programs and placement programs around that across the Group of 8 to do that. But we need to scale those opportunities. To cross that valley of death, we need proof of concept funding. It's one of the most cost-effective. Government has thrown a lot of money at the deep end of venture for follow-on when you've got a late-stage opportunity. But the most, university opportunities are so early, they're nascent. But we're talking about, $25,000, $50,000 to flesh them out, to have industry see what that value proposition is. And that's how you achieve scale. We've got to do it around the people, the talent of our graduates to go into industry is the best way to increase that absorptive capacity. So you have to look more holistically at what a university can provide to industry than just a source of innovations. It's the people that transform our industries by adopting those innovations.
And Ron, you expressed some surprise when I mentioned Israel.
Yeah, well, Israel is...
It's always held up, exactly. Yeah. But because they are funding that bit that Ron talks about, and there is a greater kind of movement between PhDs and university students going back and forth between industry. I spent some time in Israel a couple of years ago actually looking at this point. I mean, the funding model is completely different, and they're far more, their risk appetite is far greater than in Australia. And I think that's a really important point, isn't it? Because the risk appetite here in Australia is pretty low when it comes to our funding regime, would you say?
Yes, the collective activity is to have things that are completely de-risked before they're able to be absorbed by industry.
So how do you think...
In these other economies, they will go early and they'll collaborate and they'll partner early and they'll put capital at risk. So that's why the Small Business Innovation Research Fund, the SBIR in the US, has been so effective at dispensing $2.5 billion per annum that is building company by company in the US and has done for the last 40 years. And that's because it's systemic of having access to translational funding that partners industry with their university.
So this is a cultural issue. How do you change that culture then in terms of risk?
Well, that's a policy framework around that investment capital. I mean, we have some of the highest superannuation reserves globally. It's putting that capital to work. It's more effective tax treatment for early innovation. So the enterprise investment scheme that the UK has is very tax effective to get new asset classes into this space, but they have to be incentivised. We have one of the most effective through the R&D tax incentive, but companies have got to have the money to invest in the R&D to get the R&D tax incentive back. So unless you facilitate companies having the wherewithal, both human capital and financial capital, and so that's why some of these new investment schemes targeting early stage investment with a tax break for those investors are so effective.
To you, Vicky, a review is currently being headed by Jeff Connolly about this particular issue. What impact do you think that will have? Why will it make a difference?
Well, I'm actually quite optimistic about this one. I think knowing what the committee is looking at and the recommendations that they will potentially make to government, Certainly they've done their work, and I think what they'll come up with is very positive. It's then up to government, of course, to pick it up. But as Dean has mentioned, the key bottleneck is funding at the proof of concept stage. And we've talked previously, I think, when we had Professor Ian Jacobs on about the translational fund. I think in our submission suggested a $1 billion translational fund along the lines of what is funded for medical research through the Medical Research Future Fund and the Biomedical Translation Fund. So I know it's getting a bit confusing with all the funds. But, over a longer period of time. I never like to say that the answer is money because it is cultural and we've covered some of those things about what we can do about sort of porosity of movement with students and PhDs, etc. But the key bottleneck, as I see it, and Dean's the expert here, is funding at that proof of concept stage. And I think government, they understand that. And COVID has actually really focused and sharpened their attention on why this is important. So a lot of people listening today might be going, well, why do we even care about commercialisation? One of the things that COVID has shown is that we need to have, greater sovereign capability. It's exposed our supply chains, our global supply chains, where the weaknesses have been. Let me use the example of toilet paper. I know it's not commercialisation, but it's a good example of where we actually do produce toilet paper in Australia. So we were okay when people weirdly went out and bought lots of toilet paper. But we have had shortages in areas around, in medicinal areas, for example.
Pharmaceuticals.
Chemicals for agriculture, all of those sorts of things. So that has been exposed as a weakness. The way for us to build our sovereign capability and to protect, those supply chains, if you like, is through research, innovation, commercialisation. And so that's why, from our perspective, at least from my perspective, and I'm a layman in this conversation really, that's why it's so important for us. And we are the universities that do 70% of the research. And so it makes sense to, obviously we do most of the commercialisation as a result of the research that we do.
So you believe that COVID's created like a new paradigm for the Go8 universities to, commercialise more of their research or find ways to get that done?
I think it's created a new paradigm for the government to understand that actually you've had this great asset sitting there for many, many years. It's not like we haven't been doing this, and that the answer, as Dean said earlier, is not throwing funding at the wrong end of the of the pipeline, but not to say that we got to still fund that, but to look at this kind of gap that's in the middle here, which is this valley of death. And I think certainly that review which Jeff Connolly is undertaking and chairing is very alive and attuned to that. I know for a fact that this is a priority for the Prime Minister and for the Education Minister and for the Industry Minister. They've said that. And so on this one, I'm holding them to their word, and I'm feeling reasonably optimistic that this is being seen in a different light to how it's previously been viewed. I don't know, Dean, whether you have a different view to that.
No, I completely agree. We have all of the elements. What we don't have is the scale of those elements. So even in tech transfer commercialisation, the UK's example in this space was a wonderful one, that they said, if you want the universities to drive the economy in Britain, which was very much geared around manufacturing, okay, then they said, well, you need to actually resource tech transfer commercialisation, and they introduced third stream funding so that they upskilled people with our backgrounds to get more of this interface between industry and our universities. And the CRCPs and other schemes do that, but it's focused on the capital and not the human capital and the resourcing that's required for people that work at that interface. Because unless you actually put people in that valley of death interface, you'll never scale the opportunity.
Just one thing that struck me, if our universities are able to make more money eventually from the commercialisation of research in the years ahead, will that deliver an alternative income stream for our financially strapped universities? Because we've seen, what's happened with student numbers, funding, etc. Is that going to create another revenue stream?
So I think we have to be careful when we think about that, and that's if I go back to the research commercialisation income, and I use that comparison between Stanford and our group of 8 universities. I mean, Stanford have been in the business a long time, and it's still a very small proportion of their revenue. I think we need to be careful when we're talking about this in the context of government seeing this as the answer to the problem created by international students and closed borders. It's not, and it won't be. And again, Dean, you may agree or disagree. It's part of the solution to a broader issue, but I think when we're looking at funding of our universities, I would caution government, and I have, against saying this is the panacea or the replacement. It needs to be done for different reasons, not just as a revenue stream for universities. It needs to be done because commercialisation leads to those outcomes that I talked about, the cochlears, so that, hundreds of thousands of people can now hear thanks to a cochlear implant. And so, no, I don't see it as an alternative, as a sort of the panacea or the answer to the challenges that we're currently facing. But Dean, you're right in the midst of this, and you know the income earning potential. You might have a different view.
No, I think, as you say, Vicky, you can't focus overtly on commercialisation when the key is to get collaboration with industry and vice versa, industry with our universities, because there is far greater returns to the university in a holistic sense of the quality of its engagement with industry, defining the quality of its research, which underpins the quality of its teaching endeavour and the quality then of our graduates that go into that workplace. And so I see it all as a cycle that our universities are greater in totality because of that than just their research engine and what you can commercialise. So if we engage with industry effectively and efficiently with access to patient capital, we can actually drive, as I say, a new manufacturing base in Australia, which improves our global competitiveness, which overcomes some of the sovereignty issues that we've experienced, as Vicky, as discussed there about COVID. And I see that as a continuum between effective commercialisation and effective industry engagement, because there is more to be had from those partnerships where you get co-publication with industry, because it sharpens our research to be working on problems that are of the nature of industry to want to solve and benefit society, not just in biomedical, but in social endeavours, in environmental solutions, in cultural. Our work with the Indigenous community around commercialisation is starting to demonstrate that we can work very nicely with traditional owners around how they take traditional knowledge and commercialise it, but having them in control of that scenario. So there are many, many different outcomes than just profound licensing or generating another startup.
But isn't one of the big problems in Australia when it comes to commercialising university research that we're a nation of small, medium enterprises? That does Australia have the capacity to scale up new ideas, new technology in the way that the federal government has been asking and the way that universities would like to see happen?
I think with the right support of consistent policy that is supportive of the industry developing over the longer period, and I think that harmonisation at a state level with consistent programs is a start. The focus on our talent, changes to the talent attraction approach within the Australian government are to be welcomed. I think, the more effective use of the taxation system to stimulate early stage investment in innovation, diversification of our streams of investment, getting other asset classes to invest, not just our super funds. I think there is a raft of measures that you can do, and not putting it all on universities or not putting it all on industry. We all have to be at the table together. And that's one of the joys of working with Go8, because we sit down with industry to have that discussion. They are part of the solution. It's not a blame game.
Finally, to both of you, are you optimistic about the commercialisation of ideas from the lab to the marketplace in the years ahead?
Well, we've achieved two of the biggest exits. So Infrasome recently sold to Roche. Upfront was over 600 million, and Spinifex before that, over 200 million. So I see the outcomes of really being game-changing in terms of national recognition of the importance of commercialisation, but it's the importance of doing quality research and funding quality research. Our commercialisation endeavours are only as good as the quality of the research that we undertake. And the more that is industry informed, the more it will be commercially relevant and of relevance to this nation to be globally competitive.
And to you, Vicky?
Yeah, no, I am optimistic. Because of the reasons that I've articulated, that I think the federal government certainly understands the imperative, and I think there is a greater understanding of what the missing gap is. It's taken a while for us to get there because we've had countless reviews, but I think our timing is good. It's another sort of perverse positive outcome of COVID, if you like, in terms of shining a light on this. So no, I think there is reason to be optimistic.
Well, to both of you, thank you very much.
Thanks, Ron.
Thanks for your company today. If you'd like more information about the issues raised in this podcast or other related topics, please visit our website at go8.edu.au. And a quick reminder that you can always tune in to the debate at Go8 on Spotify, Google, Apple or YouTube. Bye for now.